Welcome back, folks. The arrest of Donald Trump is still pending right now. They're now saying that he could face trial next week. We'll have to see what happens with it. Protesters are starting to gather in New York, not in a large scale, but they are gathering. And I want to talk today about some of the accusations that the DA, Alvin Bragg, that Soros money may influence his decisions and may actually be playing a part in this whole thing, which would be really concerning because that would mean that while you have special interest essentially directing law enforcement to carry out the prosecution of a former president, which would be a very big deal. I want to talk about the money that he received from George Soros, how that money was intended to be used, because Soros actually wrote publicly about why he does it, and whether we can see examples of Bragg basically carrying out the orders of Soros through his actions. All of which I can tell you briefly does hold true. He is, in fact, carrying out the Soros model. He did receive money from Soros through kind of a few steps removed. But of course, Soros talked about why he donates this money, which we can see Alvin Bragg representing. It's very concerning, and actually, it's causing a lot of, I think, pretty heated debate around law enforcement in America, in ways that, interestingly, are unraveling. I would say actually unraveling some of the, I think, the shift the Democrats are trying to make. You have Biden, for example, saying that Trump and Trump supporters are the ones going against the police, and they were trying to turn the tides. This happened shortly after you saw, of course, the mayor of Chicago get pushed out, Lori Lightfoot, and that was based on her light on crime policies. Democrats took a message from that and began changing their stance on crime. This is throwing a wrench in that entire system, essentially. We'll also be talking about Biden's ties to the Trump prosecution, because this is now going to be investigated. That said, folks, I will be keeping you updated on this as we go forward. A couple other stories I want to go into as well. And thank you so much for being here. Those of you on Twitter, Rumble, Facebook, we will jump over exclusively to Epoch TV after about 25 minutes. There's a lot of stuff that we cannot talk about on YouTube. YouTube will ban us. They've given us retroactive strikes. And so all the extra spicy content is not on YouTube. So join us on Epoch TV. All right, let's jump over. Let's jump into the first story for the day. Let me show you what Trump is saying first of all. This is Trump on Truth Social, and he said this. Just out, District Attorney Alvin Bragg receives in excess of $1 million from radical left enemy of Trump, George Soros. Bragg is also very close to the Clinton campaign. Republicans and conservatives are more united than they have been in many years. Even Democrats don't like what's going on with the Manhattan DA. This is a continuation of the greatest witch hunt of all time. By witch hunt, of course, Trump is referring to the way he framed the attacks on him, going before he was even elected president, when he was still running, but continuing through his entire presidency and even continuing now. He's characterizing these things as being politically motivated, which I think, based on history and based on the fact that repeatedly the attacks on him are shown to have been based on false premise, he's justified in saying this, really. And he's interpreting this basically as a next step of that same phenomena you witnessed all through his presidency and just a bit prior to that. But I want to get into the question that he raised. Is George Soros money playing a part in what we're watching right now? Well, let's go into it. This is Daily Mail, and it talks about the nature of the George Soros money, and, well, did Bragg actually receive money from Soros? There's some nuance here which lets people claim, no, he did not receive money from George Soros. That's absolutely misleading. But he did, actually. It's just not in the way that... It wasn't like, George Soros handed him an envelope of money, at least not that we know of. It went through an organization called Color of Change, which is a PAC. Let me show you this. Daily Mail said this. During his campaign for election in 2021, Bragg received, this is the DA, Bragg received support from a political action committee that took money from George Soros. Color of Change PAC, the political action committee of the nation's largest online radical justice group, received $1 million from billionaire philanthropist Soros to support Bragg's candidacy. It says DailyMail.com revealed in February last year that the donation was later cut in half after an allegation was made against Bragg, which he strongly denied. It says Soros donated the money to Color of Change PAC as part of a $40 million drive to back district attorney campaigns across the country, according to a report in January of 2023. In other words, Soros was wanting basically DAs to enforce his vision of how law enforcement should focus on equity, particularly around race. George Soros, as do many of these DAs, believe that law enforcement is unfairly prosecuting black Americans. They believe that more black people are in prison than white people, and so there needs to be equity, meaning the manufacturing of outcomes. You no longer have equal opportunity. There's no longer equal justice under the law. It is looking to manipulate the outcome, that if 5 black people and one white person commits a crime, for example, based on equity, only one of those black individuals should go to prison and one of those white individuals should go to prison. You've achieved equity, equality of outcome. That's the nature of it. And so what you have is these, and that's just a hypothetical example, of course. But what you have is essentially these DAs reducing crimes. So you have, for example, felony crimes being reduced to misdemeanors, and this is essentially what these DAs are doing. Bragg is being accused of this, and based on the numbers, he's been doing this repeatedly. Now, I'll go into the details of that in a bit, but Daily Mail continues stating, Matt Palumbo, author of The Man Behind the Curtain Inside the Secret Network of George Soros, said the funding by Soros was incredibly successful at achieving his aims of having left-leaning district attorneys elected. It said he's had more than a 90% success rate in getting a lot of these DAs elected. He told that to Fox News in January. And he continued stating, I hate to use the term billionaire, the term brilliance with Soros, but one of the brilliant things he realized is when you want to get policy reform done with law and order, in this case, degrading it, doing it through a DA is so efficient because you don't have to go through a state legislature. You don't have to go through a mayor. Actually, other folks have pointed this out, including Elon Musk, that Soros kind of found a weak point within the system. You don't have to put that much money in to swing the election of lower level offices, district's attorney, and so on. And with $40 million, Soros, again, had a 90% success rate of getting these woke DAs appointed across the country. If you think about the major cities, and you only need one in each major city. And of course, you then alter the way that crimes are prosecuted in, let's say, 40 major cities, 90% success rate, which is about 36 out of 40 if you think about it, right? It's essentially what he's done. Now, what exactly has Soros done? I want to explain this because, are people kind of falsely accusing him by suggesting he's pushing these weak on crime policies? Are people falsely accusing him by suggesting that he's wanting these DAs to discriminate based on race? Again, maybe prosecuting fewer black Americans, prosecuting more white Americans in order to achieve equity. Well, let's look at George Soros' words and what he said directly. This is George Soros in his article that he wrote in July of 2022 in the Wall Street Journal. And George Soros, he wrote this. This is his actual writing. This is what he said he's doing. And let me go over it. George Soros wrote, "Why I support reform prosecutors," like this DA, for example, the one going after Trump. He says further in, "I have been involved in efforts to reform the criminal justice system for more than 30 years. For the more than 30 years, I've been a philanthropist." Soros continues stating, "We need to acknowledge that black people in the U.S. are 5 times as likely to be sent to jail as white people." Again, I mentioned the 5-to-1 ratio. He said, "That is an injustice that undermines our democracy." And Soros continues stating, "In recent years, reform-minded prosecutors and law enforcement officials around the country have been coalescing around an agenda that promises to be more effective and just. This agenda includes prioritizing the resources of the criminal justice system to protect people against violent crime. It urges that we treat drug addiction as a disease, not a crime, and it seeks to end the criminalization of poverty and mental illness. And Soros continues stating, this is why I have supported the election and more recently the re-election of prosecutors who support reform. I've done it transparently, and I have no intention of stopping. Now, Soros is arguing that he's claiming this does not, in fact, reduce violent crime. What he's talking about is decriminalizing drug use, essentially. We can look at New York City now, where me walking to work each day, you see people passing out like on drugs. You see people laying on the sidewalk. Drugs in New York City are now basically legal, or at least drug crimes are not being prosecuted. So George Soros' aims have been achieved to some extent. The problem you'll find, which many law enforcement, which many officers will note, is that drugs tend to be a gateway to crime, and you get career criminals who basically use crime to support a lifestyle. Drugs are often a key part of that lifestyle. And of course, the proliferation of drugs, many of these individuals who deal drugs, buy drugs, and I'm not talking about the stuff we learned about in like health class in 7th grade. I'm talking about fentanyl, really new drugs, these synthetic drugs, which will not only ruin your life, but it oftentimes will actually kill you. It's these types of drugs that have been basically legalized in many major cities. When he talks about making it so that he's decriminalizing poverty, what he's actually referring to, of course, it's not illegal to be poor in America. The way that this is often interpreted is people who are poor are basically perceived as the people who rob, and so they've decriminalized a lot of types of robbery. This is why, for example, drugstores, CVSs across the United States are being ransacked on a regular basis. Why some areas, like in California, you even have legalized theft, or at least misdemeanor theft, up to a certain amount. You can steal over $900 worth of stuff without having it become a really, anything more than a slap on the wrist type crime. This is why, for example, the CVS right around the corner from where I work has a full-time guard on duty to make sure that people don't go and ransack it. This is why you can have kids go into restaurants and trash the place and throw things on the ground and take shelves and throw them on the ground, and nobody can do anything about it. It's because they've pushed this quote-unquote this decriminalization of what they claim is poverty. The idea that people will only steal if they're poor. That's the nature of the concept. And when it comes to mental illness, well, they do frame a lot of violence as being a product of mental illness. And so rather than throwing people in prison for different types of assault or battery or whatever else, they want to offer people mental health services. And so this is the way that Soros has been altering the nature of law enforcement in the United States, and why you have what has resulted actually, which is a spike in crime. Even the few crimes that are being prosecuted represent a spike in crimes. Now, based on this, would Soros money, I'm raising this question myself, could Soros money to these prosecutors constitute a legal bias? If you have judges, well, prosecutors more so, but some judges. If you have prosecutors who have a preformed bias based on how they will deal with the case based on the color of a person's skin. In other words, they're using racial discrimination as context of how to prosecute a crime. Could you consider that pre-existing bias? Well, I would say so. I would say that actually that should be illegal, of course, because we are supposed to have equal representation under the law, and under the Civil Rights Act, you're actually not legally allowed to discriminate based on race. These woke DAs, these Soros-backed DAs, by the very nature of what they're receiving the money for and the context of it and the way they're enforcing law based on Soros's, orders with the money involved, it revolves specifically around changing the way you prosecute crimes based on the color of a person's skin. That is a violation of the Civil Rights Act. And of course, if you were a member of a jury, if you got called in for jury duty and you were asked to stand in front of the judge will ask you questions to see if you have any kind of pre-existing biases, which will make you look at, let's say, not the case itself, but instead certain information that has formed a pre-existing bias on how you will judge the guilt or innocence of an individual. A judge would excuse you. They would send you home if you express these types of pre-existing bias that these DAs are holding openly. Now, what does this actually mean in practice? Let me show you. I'll show you this individual in particular, Alvin Bragg, this DA going after Trump right now. Daily Mail had this story in November last year. It says, woke Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg has downgraded over half of felony cases to misdemeanors as criminals are free to roam streets of the Big Apple, New York City. It says, Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg has downgraded more than half of his felony cases to misdemeanors as crime continues to escalate in the Big Apple. Since taking office on January 1st, the soft-on-crime DA has downgraded 52% of felony cases to misdemeanors, and that's compared to 39% in all of 2019, according to data published on the DA's website. Of course, this has been going on for a while, including under the former mayor, Bill de Blasio. Alvin Bragg represents an even more radical view than what was even held under the previous very radical administration when it comes to the way crimes are prosecuted. It says, however, under District Attorney Cyrus Vance Jr., also very radical, but not as radical as Bragg, the percentage of cases the office downgraded between 2013 and 2020 did not go over 40%. Bragg, who campaigned last year on a promise of criminal justice reform, issued a controversial day one memo after taking office stating that he would only seek prison time in the most severe cases, like maybe in the case of Donald Trump, where he's done the opposite, whereas with all these other actual criminal cases, he took federal offenses, right, federal crimes, and downgraded them to misdemeanors. What he's doing with Trump is taking a misdemeanor and upgrading it to a federal crime. He's doing the opposite. It's the opposite of what he's been, carrying out, basically. It says that same month, career criminal William Rowland, who faced only misdemeanor charges for threatening a store worker with a knife, was told by a judge that he should feel lucky because of Bragg's new policies. You've had, for example, in many parts of the U.S., not necessarily just New York, people who were let off the hook by these Soros-backed DAs who, again, should have been in prison, who went off and murdered people, who went off and killed police officers soon after being released. I would argue that George Soros has blood on his hands, that he should be responsible for the murders of police officers and individuals because people who should have been behind bars were allowed to roam free, and they killed people. This has happened repeatedly in California, it's happened repeatedly in New York, and it's happened repeatedly in other parts of the U.S., where individuals like Alvin Bragg and Alvin Bragg have done this, in my personal opinion. It notes this, though, violent crime in the Big Apple has soared by nearly 30% from last year. And the case, and again, I'm noting this, right? This is violent crime, not just regular crime, but violent crime is increasing. It says, in the case of that serious charges are brought, the new data revealed that Bragg's office wins a conviction only 51% of the time, which is down from 68% in 2019. The court system was then disrupted for a short time due to the pandemic. The data also revealed that Bragg declined to prosecute 35% more felony cases this year than that was prosecuted in 2019. It says so far there have been 1,119 in 2020 compared to 828 in 2019 when the pandemic was starting. The DA's office has only convicted 29% of misdemeanors so far this year compared to 68% in 2019. Bail has been requested in only 49% of felony cases this year compared to 69% in 2019. I can tell you I personally have colleagues who have been assaulted recently in New York, including punched, including stabbed in the neck on the train. This is happening in New York City. New York City has become a very dangerous place. And what you're facing right now is a pseudo-legalization of crime. What we're looking at is two different factors. On one side, you could say there's a reduction in prosecutions. There's a reduction in them, of course, going after felony crimes, downgrading them from felonies to misdemeanors. But you also have the uncounted numbers, which are cases that are not even being investigated or where people are not even being arrested in the first place. I can attest to this. I left New York during the pandemic, at least where I live. But previously I lived in Queens. I left again during the pandemic. I can tell you there is now legalized prostitution. You have women soliciting themselves in the open. I can tell you openly now because I used to live in Jackson Heights. You have gangs, actual gangs, that run the subway turnstiles, who charge people based on swipes. The police do nothing about it. There's open crime in New York City. Nothing is done about it. And I'm talking human trafficking. I'm talking about gangs extorting people. Nothing is done about it. This is the new New York City. And so those types of crimes are the unprosecuted crimes. Those types of crimes are the ones not even being counted on these numbers. And even the ones being counted, you see an increase. This is what this individual represents, what George Soros money represents, and what these woke DAs represent. And this is now becoming a campaign talking point for Republicans as well. And this is something very important. The targeting of George Soros. Oh, hey, James Dyson said he lived in Astoria for about 24 years ago. I used to live in Astoria too, actually, before I moved to Jackson Heights. But sorry, random point, folks. What's interesting now is that you had kind of a race on who was going to control the narrative on crime. And you saw the shift take place soon after Lori Lightfoot, the mayor of Chicago, was forced to step down. She was replaced, right? The one they called Beetlejuice, that one. Schmeagol, Gollum. People called her names and so on. But, she was a soft on crime mayor, and Chicago being one of the murder capitals of America, she was held responsible for the crimes in her city. You had the same problems there as you do in New York. This race-based prosecutions, this racial manipulation of the way crime is looked at. And of course, what happened is people got sick of it. And based on people getting sick of it, they removed Lori Lightfoot from office. It was right after that you saw a shift in narrative. The Democrats actually began pivoting their stance on crime. In fact, Joe Biden himself came out and tried pivoting. I'll show you that in a second. But Republicans are now using this. There's a battle for who controls that narrative. And I will say this, that based on what we're seeing now with them going after Trump, Republicans are going to now own the narrative on crime. That battle of who controls it has been taken by the Republicans. Let me show you this. This is Twitter. This is the House GOP Judiciary Committee. And they say the Manhattan DA's office doesn't care about actual criminals, only political opponents. And they posted this stat showing the rise in felonies in New York City. And again, these are only what are being prosecuted. This doesn't include the ones being reduced from felonies to misdemeanors. And just backing up these numbers, they're not making this up. These are accurate numbers. This is New York Post demonstrating this. They say New York City saw record levels of felony crimes last year, the most over 15 years, and they've only been counting it about that long. New York Post said the streets of New York are meaner than they've been in more than 15 years thanks to soaring felony crimes, new police data reveals. And again, these are only what are being prosecuted. Remember that more than 50% are being reduced, so the number should actually be double this. The real number is double this, at least, right? It says the data released last week shows a record 172,852 felonies reported in 2022. That's up 20.4% from 2021, when 143,522 complaints were recorded. This is the former NYPD supervisor Chris Herman saying things in a large city aren't supposed to grow that much or go down that much in 1 year. This is kind of like monumental kind of stuff, like once in a lifetime. I'll emphasize 2 points. As I mentioned, this is accounting for the fact that the number should actually be double this, because Alvin Bragg has been reducing felonies to misdemeanors by at least 52%. That is discounting the fact as well, though, that remember, drug crimes are felony crimes. You can have, I don't know what the laws are these days, but I think you can, there's a certain threshold of marijuana, for example, that marijuana possession over a certain threshold, like maybe a few ounces or something like that, becomes a felony crime. Those are no longer being prosecuted. Most of the hard drugs like heroin, fentanyl, ecstasy, these kinds of things, those are felony crimes. Those crimes are not even being prosecuted at all right now, for the most part. Meaning the number of felonies you're seeing now, this discounts the fact they're reducing them by half by downgrading charges, and this also should include the fact that they're not even charging drug crimes, which used to constitute most of the felony crimes. And so that rise in crime, that spike in felony crime, that's violent crime for the most part. That is the type of crime that represented a small subset of the actual crime of what was called crime before. Meaning the crime rate is through the roof compared to that. These numbers do not represent the real crime rate or the real increase in crime in New York. It's significantly higher because of the way they've altered how this is looked at. Now, this is also backfiring on Biden, because I mentioned the Democrats tried pivoting their narrative on law enforcement and crime. Let me show you this. This was shortly after Lori Lightfoot was removed from office, and when Democrats realized that their light on crime policies are going to lose them elections. They realized this with Lori Lightfoot. Let me show you what Biden said. This was Biden coming out. This is a video of him. Here's Biden on crime, trying to pivot the narrative. I'll show you.
And so, folks, look, MAGA Republicans are calling for defunding the police departments and defunding the FBI now. That's a good one. I like that one. Well, guess what? And the refuse to provide funding is going to keep communities safe and secure. We talk about crime. Well, it's outrageous. My budget invests in public safety. It includes funding for more training, more support for law enforcement, at a time when they're expected to play many roles.
You get that, folks? It's the Republicans who want to defund the police. And, of course, Biden represents the funding of the police and better training. Of course, I don't remember Republicans calling for defunding the police. Although I will say you actually, to his credit, you have seen a shift in the narrative on policing, especially after January 6th. You have had some Republicans become more anti-law enforcement because of that. And he is right that Republicans are actually calling for defunding the FBI. This has actually become a campaign point, mainly based on the idea of politicization of the federal government and the FBI. But what is going on is not really that. What is going on is the weak on crime policies and public safety. Of course, a narrative that we've been discussing, and a narrative that really they've just lost. Democrats have just lost hold of that narrative. This is now shifting. This is Trump now basically having that narrative for 2024 and the entire Republican GOP getting behind it. They own the narrative on crime now because of Alvin Bragg and Soros money manipulating this and going after Trump. The Democrats shot themselves in the foot like like Wile E. Coyote. And this is Trump on Twitter, on Truth Social, stating this. Let me show you. Trump said this. Trump said, "Can you imagine the great New York City Police Department, correctly referred to as New York City's finest, who for the first and only time in history endorsed a president, me, and honored me as the man of the year, having to defend and protect the defunders and cop haters of the radical left that want to put their greatest champion of friend in prison for a crime that doesn't exist. All the while, the Soros-backed DA allows murderers and other violent criminals to freely roam the sidewalks of New York." I want to emphasize, what you're watching here is not just the prosecution of Trump or the potential arrest of Trump. What you're watching is not just, the prospect that Trump could face charges for a misdemeanor elevated to a felony crime. What you're watching here is the entire public attention, globally in fact, shifting to a key problem of law enforcement in America. That George Soros money is altering the way that crime is being prosecuted. George Soros money is resulting in politicization of law enforcement. George Soros money represents the reduction of felonies to misdemeanors. George Soros money represents murderers and thieves and killers being loose on America's streets. George Soros money represents a spike in felony crime. And George Soros money has become synonymous with Democrat policy. This is Republicans winning that narrative battle and having one of the big narratives for 2024 now under their belt. Trump is interestingly using this, targeting of him, whether you agree with it or not, as something that will significantly benefit him in the 2024 presidential elections. And this is one more example of it. Trump said this on Truth Social. "Remember the same animals and thugs that would do this to perhaps 200 million people, but actually all Americans, are the communists, Marxists, rhinos," referring to Republicans who side with the Democrats, what he calls them, "and losers that are purposefully destroying our nation." What you're watching is Trump framing the lens through which people perceive this type of prosecution, politicized prosecution. Trump is altering the way it is being looked at right now. Folks, there's a bit more to go into, so I want to jump over to Epoch TV for the rest. But I want to go into what's happening with Alvin Bragg and a bit more on him. I want to show you his evidence of his pre-existing bias, in fact, things that would normally force someone to step down from a case like this. I also want to go into what's happening with Joe Biden and his ties to this case, investigations currently being rolled out, and actually some of his ties to China money, which is coming out at this exact same time. All very concerning stuff. For that, though, we're going to jump over to Epoch TV exclusively. Before we jump over, though, folks, the documentary, The Real Story of January 6th, if you haven't seen it yet, watch it. But we now have DVDs for sale. You can buy a copy of it. You can own it. Nobody can take it from you unless they, physically take it, but that's going to be hard for them. You can buy it now. That's on the Epoch TV shop. That's epochshop.tv. And you can use the promo code Joshua for 20% off. Let me show you the trailer of that, then we'll jump over to Epoch TV exclusively.
That was a shooting gallery up there.
I could hear the tremble in his voice.
She suffered a fairly severe beating. The video is pretty graphic.
Justice for us seems almost impossible.
It's not fun to watch somebody die, and they knew she was in mortal peril.
They have not asked the hard questions. Why was the Capitol intentionally unsecure that day?
The FBI had information about security concerns before January 6th.
They're out for blood, and they're getting it. They appear to be winning.
Were the actions of the Capitol Police out of line? Were there violations and use of force?
Now I describe it as an inside job.
I'm ready to do whatever God calls me.
Again, folks, that's on Epoch TV, and you can now buy the DVDs on our website shop, so check it out. It says jump over to Epoch TV exclusively, and I will see you there. And folks, I see some of you saying that Soros should be